Gabrielle Javier-Cerulli with Her Turn, and I am here with a very special guest, Angie Trudell Vasquez. She is Madison's Poet Laureate for 2020 until 2022.
That's the term.
Yep. And then she's also additionally the chair for the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell the listeners about yourself?
Sure. I'm a Mexican-American Chicana, originally from Iowa. I have been writing since the age of 7, and I am a big fan of Warped, I will say. Warped got me through so much. And I know all the radio stations, and Saturdays are all day listening. So to me, poetry and music and art go hand in hand. Yeah.
Awesome. Yay. The word poet laureate is thrown around, but what does that actually mean? And why is it important to even have them?
Sure. I'm an ambassador for poetry in the city of Madison. And to me, that means I bring poetry to the people. And that's all people, regardless of any kind of party affiliation. I think poetry can cut through so much. So for me, this is an honor to do this. I have been watching people do this since I was in my 20s. What is it to be a poet laureate? And to me, that means you take poetry to the people where they are. So I have done poetry in many places in my term. Even with the pandemic, I've been able to reach people. And I'm really happy that we've had this virtual boom, because now we can cross rivers. I did a reading bringing Indigenous poetics to the city of Madison back in October for Indigenous Peoples Day. And we had people turn in from 26 states and 4 continents. We had 168 people, Gabrielle. That's how hungry people are for poetry. Like when we're born, there's a poem. When you're a poet in the family and somebody passes, dies, you write a poem. Yeah.
Well, so then that brings me to the next question of how did you get to where you are today? What was your journey?
So in my 20s, I was a Ruth Lilly Fellow for the Poetry Foundation, and that opened up a lot of doors to me. That really started me on a journey, and I went to Indiana University, and I'm in the poetry scene, and I'm reading the poetry festivals in Des Moines. And then I moved to Seattle, and I become part of Los Norteños there, and I'm part of the writing scene. And I always found that if I go to a new place, volunteering is a great way to meet people who have the same concerns I do. So I worked with Casa Latina, and I worked with the Feminist Women's Health Center, and I was in the literary scene. So I'm combining my activism and my art there. And I got to perform at Bumbershoot, which is Seattle's literary art music festival. And that was huge for me. Okay. And so then I moved to Milwaukee, and I moved to the Wisconsin area. And immediately upon getting here, I get into the literary scene. I work at the ACLU, and I'm tied in with the poetry and the activists there. And I'm the first poet female poet they hired to work with their youth program. They had 2 great male poets, African-American males, were the first people I performed with, Kwabena Nixon and Wuhib Dyer. And they're still doing great things, but they didn't have a female, and they didn't have a Latina. And so that was my entry there. And I worked with Woodland Pattern Book Center as a board member and started doing readings there. You have to network as an artist.
Yeah.
And I've always written, Gabrielle, most every day of my life, pretty much from the time I was a child. And I write, the child who would read under her covers and your parents would say, go to bed, or I would write under my covers and they'd say, go to bed. So I've always been writing. I have every journal that I've ever written in from the age of 7, and now I'm 53. So I have all these journals in addition to the poetry and the books and stuff. And for me, I've always been a writer. It was my way of understanding my place in the world as a woman who grew up, a woman of color in a 99% white environment in a suburb of Des Moines, Iowa. We were the one. And I think for me, writing helped me find my place. No, I found myself through poetry. I don't know often what I think until I write it down. And it's a discovery process. So in my 20s, I always loved English, always loved literature.
Of your biggest influences,
Yeah.
like maybe maybe teen 20s and now in your 50s? Like, who are
Yeah,
the
yeah.
influences?
Well, there's one who's been with me the whole time. Um,
Ah.
yeah. So I have to back up and say, as a child, I read Frederick, and Frederick was a poet mouse. And that kind of led me to be a poet. Because I'm like, oh, Frederick can feed people through words. But going to Drake University and going to the University of Iowa, I became aware of the feminist canon and the African American literature canon and the Latino canon. And there's all these great writers that I was introduced to, and through history and through literature and through poetry, I find myself in my 20s at Drake, and I was introduced to Carolyn Forche and her famous book, The Country Between Us. And the poem, The Colonel, in that has been with me since that time. And it blew my mind because I had already been introduced to the Beats and Allen Ginsberg and Howe. And I'd already been introduced to Stanley Kunitz. But then here's this like poet, female poet, who went to El Salvador in her 20s and came back and wrote this book. And it taught me that poetry can do more. And she coined the term poetry of witness. So Carolyn Forche was kind of like the moment where I had an epiphany as a poet of what poetry could do. My influences now are probably more in indigenous poetics. So the people I worked with who mentored me at the Institute of American Indian Arts remain so in my mind and in my heart for poetry. So Joan Nevaeh Kane, Santi Frazier, Sherwin Bitsui, John Davis.
So then your broader role as the chair of Wisconsin Public Laureate Commission.
So I've been on the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission as an at-large member since I want to say 2017.
Okay.
So pretty much upon graduating with my MFA. And so I helped select the former Wisconsin Poet Laureate, Margaret Rosca, who's also a civil rights activist and long well-known poet in the Milwaukee area. So Margaret Roscoe is the first person that I had the chance to vote on. Dasha Kelly Hamilton is in the role now.
Does every state have a poet laureate?
Some do, some don't. This particular embodiment of the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission is completely divested from the state of Wisconsin. We have member orgs that support us. The Wisconsin Academy is our fiscal agent. And so we are not just one, we have many arts organizations that are part of the Wisconsin Poet Laureate Commission. So it's very structured. Yeah.
But separate.
Yes, and when Scott Walker, the former governor, basically said we don't need poetry, right? And it's always interesting what politicians fear. Like, why would you fear a poet? So to me, I think we do better without being tied to the stage. We're all volunteer. Yeah, we're a small but mighty group who make the decision for the state of Wisconsin.
What's coming up for you this summer for 2021 summer?
Yes, well, I'm doing a benefit next week for Voces de la Frontera and a synagogue. And I'm doing a reading at Arts, Literature, and Laboratory on Saturday for Sheltering with Poems. I have a poem in that anthology. So that'll get me through July. I have a book too I need to finish. I've been asked by a publisher to send my next manuscript. They'd love to see it, is what they told me, which you never get. You never get someone to say, send me your work. So I'm working on new and selected poems for that. Yeah, and then we have to celebrate the Bustline Poetry Images.
Yeah, what is that?
Oh, that's so much fun. So there's 40 pieces that I've selected. Every year, Metro Transit does a collaboration with Edgewood College and the Poet Laureate, and people submit poems to a theme. And my theme was, what are we going to do after the pandemic? So looking forward, right? What are you looking forward to? And it's beautiful. There's many youth in there. There's people from all levels in terms of poetry, in terms of age, in terms of gender identity, and it's beautiful.
How can people find you?
Can be found on my website. People can contact me for readings or to judge poetry events or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I do a lot of that work too. And that's AngieTrudellVasquez.com.
If you share one of your poems.
Yes, I am going to share a poem. This is one that's on the Poetry Foundation website. Okay. And I think it ties into some history. So like, how do you become a poet, right? You open yourself to the world. and you observe, and you try and capture that on the page, and you sculpt the words, and you sculpt the things that you care about. So this is for my parents. So we'll celebrate this. Identity. White Mexican looks like a Latina, not my label. A question from a Guatemalan student who's come undone in my ESL class. Doesn't get my kind. I try to describe how I grew up in Caucasian corn country, surrounded by houses on cul-de-sacs that all look the same. How we were alone in a town of 5,000. One Black family, one Indian family, one Asian family, and one household of Mexicans. No, two. Us and the Renterias, to whom we were related by marriage before and after my divorce. And they were mixed. Still, it was a good living. Happy in our cocoonness, our oneness, separated by money one direction, color on the other, classes, classes, classes. Day and night we took lessons, piano, jazz, tap, ballet, the dance team, trumpet, trombone, tennis, finishing school, and one awful summer, golf. Christian, confirmed, catechismized, it all cut me in several places, molding of head and heart, making me ultra sensitive then and now, an observer of the outside, an outsider among my own kind, my very shade, mysterious, aloof, black-haired beauty who can't speak Spanish, living among blue-eyed, dyed, blonde bombshells, who held up her head higher because she's shy, not stuck up. Understood, undenied, sacrificed to at any price by my beloved little brown parrots, who taught me well, gave up so much so their daughters could shine, and they'd swell with pride at the life they had given us. On Sundays, we basked in mutual admiration after Mass, singing our church songs while making breakfast, according to the unspoken doctrine in our house of fast first, eat later after communion. We intruded with our Mexican music, bellowing out the open windows, the smell of bacon frying, pancakes baking, coffee and eggs scrambled to order. It wafted out on beautiful summer mornings out of our house in Pleasant Hill, Iowa, perched on the highest spot one could reach on the east side of the street for first and second generation immigrants. And that's from January 25th, 2001.
Oh, bravo, bravo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was so moving. And it's just, I see it all. But you paint with words. I mean, it was just so powerful. So thank you so much for sharing your gift.
Gabrielle, that's the highest honor, that I paint with words, because I see words as I write them, right? But I am trying to paint a picture for people. And that is what poetry is. We are so rich in Wisconsin in artists. I found this old book I was looking at, and it said there are more Wisconsin poets than any other state in the Union. Wow. And it's from 18 something. It's fertile ground.
Wow, that's a big statement right there.
It is a big statement. Yeah, I was going to copy it because to me that's a really important, that was noted back then in a paper. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Angie, for hanging out with us. And
you said something. You said something. It was really important.